This is Cannaramic, and we're bringing you cannabis like you've never seen it before. Today, we are so delighted to have Melissa Moore from the Drug Policy Alliance right in New York City. She has been an advocate on the ground for over 13 years, working in the advocacy, drug reform advocacy space, and has done so much work appearing on panels and workshops, teaching about marijuana reform. You've been on CNN, you've been on, television, you've been quoted in newspapers. This is hard work, and to be doing it for so long, it's not very rewarding. So what is it that drives you to do this work?
Yeah, for me, what really drives all of the work that I do in the activism space and the legislative advocacy really comes back to the experiences that I had growing up in Los Angeles at the height of the war on drugs there, and seeing firsthand the way it affected my community, the way that young people were criminalized, were stopped, were frisked, were harassed by police, and oftentimes had the trajectory of their entire lives changed because of the war on drugs, because of criminalization, and really seeing what that did in terms of those individuals, but also the broader effects on the community, on our entire state, and on our country, and knowing that that was unacceptable, seeing very clearly that certain people who I was growing up with and who I was around always got the benefit of the doubt, right? Their well-being was centered, and then for other people in other communities, it was the exact opposite. Always the worst was assumed. There were inroads and targeting and hypercriminalization where there should have been compassion and resources and everything done to uplift people. So when we think about the work that we're doing to fight against the war on drugs and to establish sane and effective policies in this realm, it's really not just about the intent of the law itself, or kind of all of the policy wonk things that we can get into and that do take up a lot of my day and a lot of my time. But for me, it's always looking back to who are we accountable to at the end of the day? Who am I accountable to when I'm doing this work? And it's the folks who day in, day out are experiencing the very worst that our society has to offer, when instead we have a responsibility to do better and to do more. And so that really shapes a lot of the conversations that I'm in with regard to cannabis reform, but then of course within looking at the whole drug policy movement and criminal justice reform conversations too, is how do we really center the lives of the people who have been directly affected and lift up their voices and provide space for folks to be leaders on this issue.
Yeah, because one of the things that I know that people talk about the war on drugs, but unfortunately, I know that the facts is that it's been ineffective, right? It's not actually accomplished anything that it was set out to do, if it really was set out to do anything specific. How effective has the war on drugs really been in terms of accomplishing positive results for drug use?
Yeah, I think prohibition has been a total failure in the overt goal of reducing use, keeping people safe. It's been a complete and total train wreck in that regard. We see rates of use that are actually higher all across the country than they've ever been before, and at the same time, immense criminalization and immense harm being done. But if we look at the underlying reasons that inform the war on drugs, the reasons why all of these different agencies and laws and targeting was created in the first place, it was never about the substance of the cannabis plant. It was never about the pharmacology of any banned substance. It's really about a mechanism of control and a way to target certain communities and certain individuals as a proxy, right? As the war on drugs was being developed, certainly in its initial phases, the reason why so much of the country calls cannabis by the term marijuana is because that was a very explicit intention of linking it with newly arrived Mexican migrants in the southwest of the country at a time when they were trying to do everything possible to marginalize that group of people. So you get these sort of links, the reefer madness conversations, a lot of the framing around how cannabis might interact with the body. That was complete misinformation, total propaganda, not in any way rooted in science. And when we have reports consistently coming out decade after decade refuting all of those lies and that propaganda, but nonetheless the desperate clinging to it and the doubling down and consistently reinforcing of that telling of the tale, I think is really indicative of the kind of structures and specific racist aspects to the war on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we have to go after at the root of the issue, right? If we're not just going to rearrange kind of ships on the Titanic, or chairs on the Titanic, but actually get at, how do we undo this thing at its core? How do we retract the tentacles of the war on drugs? It's really about going at those structural racist and inequitable facets. It's not just about changing a policy here, making an adjustment there. We really have to go deeper than that if we're ever going to get past it.
Wow, this is, when we talk about the racist aspect being at the root of it, that's at the root of the foundation of this country, right? So this is a huge undertaking. And you're saying that when cannabis became illegal in 1937, the arguments that they put forth were not legitimate arguments. It was really rooted in racism. What was the actual argument that they made at that time? What did they say to make the public buy into it?
Yeah, there were a variety of claims, each one almost more racist than the next. Oftentimes it was, this is going to cause mixing of social groups that we don't want to see interacting, right? So like some of the early efforts to ban cannabis, we're talking about a state like New York, there was this huge renaissance within the jazz era. Young people from Black community, white community were coming together and actually interacting in a way through music, through jazz, in a way that hadn't been the case before. And when we look at some of the early cannabis prohibition in New York in specific, a lot of it was responsive to wanting to keep these groups separate, wanting to maintain segregation in a way that is absolutely abhorrent. When we look across the country as well, there was the reefer madness conversation that you're going to lose your mind and become psychotic. There were headlines about supposedly, a Mexican mother who had gone insane and whose children now were going to be cast out, and it was an irreversible psychosis, obviously not grounded in any bit of truth whatsoever. It's incredibly problematic framing, and it builds in then and ties it with all the other sort of racist propaganda and notions about certain communities and certain groups, talking about that this was gonna, make people of a certain color feel empowered to go after white women. Like, we have to think about all of those incredibly problematic conversations and framings that were part of.
This was all coming from actually the government, or was it just kind of like a propaganda machine that was operating under the guise of something else? Was this coming from the government?
Absolutely. This was both and. This was Harry Anslinger, who relentlessly went after, people like Louis Armstrong, people like, just absurd criminalization, specifically as a way to drive a wedge in communities. When we look at Nina Simone and her experiences being targeted for substance use, again, we see that as a way to drive at people, and we see it to the present day, right? There are groups of people who are specifically criminalized for behavior and for substance use in a way that is totally different from other people. So when we look at, for example, the implications of a marijuana allegation, not even arrest, not even a conviction, not even actual proven instances of use or of problematic use, let alone, and the way that it can be used as a way to separate families, to remove children from particularly a mother who might have been drug tested against her consent while delivering, and then 2 days later, her babies are being snatched from her despite zero proof whatsoever of any harm or neglect, which is actually what the provision is.
Well, I want to definitely get into all that, because you described that so well as the ripple effect, and I want people to understand that. But give us a perspective in terms of marijuana arrests since 1937. How pervasive has this been in terms of people in the country being arrested for marijuana since then?
Yeah, the scope of marijuana enforcement is massive in this country. People have been seeing states legalize, and so often folks think that there's less of an emphasis on it now than there has been previously. But we know even to this day, it's still a significant issue. More than 600,000 people across the country are arrested for low-level marijuana every single year. And that's massive. And when we look at the state of New York in particular, we see that, from the early times of Prohibition, up until in 1977, when New York said, we should actually decriminalize this. This is ruining young people's lives. It's derailing folks in a way that doesn't make any sense. Let's change this law and statute. Even from that time, for something that was hypothetically decriminalized, we see in the era of stop and frisk policing and broken windows policing that suddenly we have 800,000 arrests for this offense in the last 20 years alone in New York. And that's not to mention, like we said, the other ripple effects that has in terms of people being able to secure employment, work in certain industries, all of these things that end up being hugely problematic. So the scope of the harm from prohibition is monumental. And that's why the fix for that, right? Like whatever we do in terms of legalization has to be as enormous, as comprehensive, as diligent, and as intentional as the harm that was done.
So when you talk about those 800,000 arrests, are they, I understand that they're disproportionately in the Latino and African American communities. Has this been, you talk about it being used, cannabis, marijuana prohibition being used as a tool for racism. Is that what we saw when we're looking at that proportion to the fact that whites use cannabis just as much as African Americans do? Why is it so disproportionate? Is that what it is?
No, it's not in any way reflective of actual use. And that's where the problem lies. And that's where the disparities that have been documented decade after decade really come into play in informing, our whole conversation about marijuana justice, right? When we see that those 800,000 arrests, that 80% of them were Black and Latinx people in New York, that's absurd, because we know that's not at all reflective of use rates. And so instead it comes down to, which neighborhoods were targeted, which neighborhoods had patrols just constantly going up to particularly young Black and Latinx New Yorkers, telling them to empty their pockets, patting folks down with zero probable cause, no reason for that interaction whatsoever. But the fact that you have marijuana prohibition allows for a justification for that sort of targeting to happen, right? And then from there, we see how that can spiral in somebody's life, where maybe they get a notice to appear, right, an ACD. And then from that, if somebody misses their court date for whatever reason, right, or if something else happens, that can turn into then an open warrant, where suddenly you have this offense that has now spiraled. Whereas in other communities, people are told, just discard that, put it out, carry on with your life. And so we have these extreme disparities where even in adjoining like neighborhood or neighboring precincts in New York, like comparing East Harlem to the Upper East Side. In the Upper East Side, in certain years, you had more enforcement around parents allowing their children to ride a bicycle without a helmet than you did marijuana. Versus in East Harlem, which is right next door, where you had some of the highest enforcement rates in the entire city.
Right.
Meanwhile,
the usage is pretty much the same.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Exactly. You have, parents from more well-to-do areas writing op-eds in the New York Times about how, using cannabis makes them a better parent, which, everybody should be able to explore their full rights and what makes them the best person they are. But the problem is when we have this sort of complete disparities between who is able to do that, who is allowed to avail themselves, even of medical marijuana in this state, right? When we talk about medical cannabis program, the Compassionate Care Act, and the fact that it's so unaffordable, so unattainable for most people that they're not able to enjoy the sort of medical benefits that they need from that medicine, right? Like the wellness and well-being aspect of this plant, like as we're talking about seeing cannabis differently and the way that it can alleviate chronic pain and actually help people who might be struggling with substance abuse exit that problematic use. There are so many different opportunities to be able to avail ourselves of what cannabis can do, but the fact that it's been so stigmatized and so criminalized really block off a lot of those options for so many people.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this a lot of times about this young lady in the church that I go to. I told her, you should look into medical marijuana for your lupus, and she said, well, I don't mess with that stuff. So we got the issue of the stigma and the misinformation, and then you talked about access, because it's not covered under Medicare or any of your insurances, so you have to have cash, which now prohibits who can access it and who can't. So I wanted to go back to the ripple effect. And when you explained this to me before, it was like so profound. So I really need you to just kind of break it down for people, because you're saying that when a person is arrested, and you're talking about they have a, I think during stop and frisk, any amount of marijuana was, you can be arrested for, right? It wasn't like under an ounce or anything. There wasn't a limit. So you could be walking around with a marijuana cigarette, in your pocket, and the police come over and they say, empty your pocket, because that's what they could do at that time. Mm-hmm. What happens from that point, and what's the ripple effect of that person's arrest?
Right. So hypothetically, people in that scenario shouldn't have been arrested at all. According to the decriminalization that went through, it was a bipartisan bill in 1977. But what happened was there was a loophole. So that bill allowed for, if cannabis was in public view, quote unquote, then officers had discretion about how to handle that. And it could be a misdemeanor. If it was in private possession, under 25 grams, fine. It's a ticket, that's it. But what you have with stop and frisk is officers going up, patting people down, saying, what's in your pocket? And people complying with an officer's order, right? Because you're not really in a position, even though people would have the right to refuse that, the power dynamic is such that most people, especially, people know right. You're not about to try to navigate that terrain, right? That's very complicated. And so you have a situation where especially young people are emptying their pockets and the cops saying, all right, well, now that's in public view.
Wow.
Even though it was at my order, and I'm going to arrest you now and take you in for that. And it's not just a simple, quick thing. This is just the arrest itself means that somebody has to go be taken into the precinct. They're sent to central booking. They're processed through the entire system. If it's a Friday, sometimes they actually will be held the entire weekend. It depends, right? And then from there, you have all of the additional court appearances that have to happen. You have fees, fines on top of that. And like I said, if somebody misses their court date for whatever reason, right? It could be that it's when they have to be at work, or something else is happening with their family, or they can't get childcare. Then that can turn into an open warrant. But beyond all of these things, in that moment of what the trauma is, and somebody from our coalition puts it really well, Anthony Posada, who's now an attorney with Legal Aid Society in their community justice unit, but he talks about part of what drove him to that work was his own experience of being 17 years old as a Latinx man in Queens, who had officers, plainclothes, run up on him, pull guns out and hold him to his head. And in the end, he was arrested for low-level marijuana possession, hauled into the precinct, and had to run through this whole rigmarole that deeply affected him, right? The trauma of that moment. But then beyond that, we see how it ends up playing out in terms of people being able to secure employment, right? Even if somebody gets an ACD, which means that the offense will basically move out of their record after a certain period of time if they haven't had further contact with the criminal legal system. But that's usually 6 to 12 months. So in that time, they have an open court case pending against them. And prosecutors often talk about that as oh, it's not really a big deal. There isn't all of this other aspect of the criminal legal system associated with it. But that's incredibly difficult for that person to navigate during that time, right? And when we also look at the immigration consequences, cannabis is just low-level possession is the 4th most common reason why somebody is deported or deemed inadmissible to this country. And there's no statute of limitations on it. So what we're seeing and what we're hearing about consistently from partners like the Immigrant Defense Project, other entities that do a lot of work with folks who have somewhat complicated status, is that they're getting notices to basically a deportation order based off of a 10-year-old, 12-year-old low-level marijuana possession arrest. And when we think about where the enforcement was, especially in New York, and which communities were targeted, there's a heightened vulnerability there, right? And when we're talking about the child welfare implications and how it can be based on just an allegation in practice. That's not the way the law is structured, but the way it plays out is if somebody alleges that somebody is using cannabis in a problematic way, that can get flagged to the state central registry, which then basically classifies that person in the same way as other people who abuse children in the state. And from that indication on that case, it actually remains in place until that person's youngest child is 28. It's 10 years after that person's youngest child turns 18. So in that time, that person can't secure employment that has anything to do with children. A lot of home care and other healthcare opportunities are cut off to them. Not to mention the, that stigma and that branding as somebody who does that sort of activity, which is absolutely not the case at all, right?
That's
And
just
not
like
having
allegation. Someone calls and says that I know I've seen this person, or I think this person's smoking, and now you've got this report about you that's following you to your children are of age. And guess if something happens in between that time, like your child is injured, then here comes this report indicating that you're a bad parent in some case.
Exactly. And then everything compounds from there. Or they can pop in and do basically unscheduled inspections of a home environment or something like that. And oftentimes then you see the compounding effects of poverty in these situations where somebody might not have a cupboard fully stocked with food, right? And then that becomes another indication. And things just build and build and build. Or somebody might have a separate case for, whatever reason is happening. And then on top of that comes a cannabis allegation that would then require that person to go to all sorts of treatment programs, all these other things when they're not actually a problematic substance user, right? And somebody might not have even actually used that substance, so they can't get into the treatment program because they can't actually do a positive urine screen for that substance. So they're caught in this middle ground, right? So all of these ways in which this sort of tentacles or the web of mass criminalization, beyond just mass incarceration, mass criminalization ends up taking place.
You also talk about public housing, how people can lose their public housing. So a person,
that's right. Because of permanent exclusion, if somebody has a cannabis related offense or a low level offense for many different things, it can be that their family members who are in public housing then have to choose whether they see that person, whether they allow them to come onto the premises, which could be grounds for their own eviction, which makes no sense, right? When we're talking about what supposedly is in the best interest of community, that's not it, right? Like we see over and over again, the disconnect between policies, both either as they're written or as they're enforced and practiced, and supposedly what the goals are, right? And there's just a consistent mismatch. And so that led us to the point of saying, well, let's take this apart then, and let's look at every aspect within that ripple effect. So working with the New York City Council, for example, to pass through a huge package of bills that addresses not using marijuana as a pre-employment drug test screen any longer, not using it as a reason to violate somebody's probation because there's no public safety reason to do that, right? Making sure that people won't be banned from getting certain professional licenses just because of off-the-clock marijuana use. Things of that nature, making sure people can't get kicked out of housing anymore for marijuana, making sure that there's adequate reporting around all of these other systems and effects.
So right now, I know that I read recently the employment testing for marijuana cannot be done in New York City. Was that part of the efforts that you guys did?
That was precisely one of the bills that we worked really closely with the Black, Latino, and Asian caucus and the Progressive caucus at the city council level, where they said, look, we see how criminalization is hurting our communities. We want Albany to take action. We need to have statewide legalization. But in the meantime, we're going to handle all of these different administrative things that are actually under our purview. New York City and many other cities like Rochester City Council also just issued a statement in support of legalization and is looking at what they can address, in their own home court, and really doing a deep dive on that because it's necessary. Of course we need statewide action, but because of all of the compounding effects that we have woven into criminalization, we also unraveling to do, and that can happen right now at the city level in the same time frame that we're pushing very much for regulation and legalization at the state level, which has to happen by this June.
Now, are there people, I mean, this makes so much sense to me and anybody I would think that has any sense in their brain. Are there people who are saying, well, the law was the law and these people broke the law and, we don't have to give what would be considered restitution or any form of reparations to this community that's affected? Are there people that are saying that? Yeah, what's the ground for their argument?
Yeah, I mean, there has been pushback on that. A lot of it is due to the sort of institutional stigma that we've had for so long. People saying that, well, if somebody has this offense, then they're obviously a bad person, or trying to characterize communities that have been targeted and over-policed as somehow have taken action that's deserving of that, which is obviously totally false and unfounded, right? Like we have the data to back that up. And so it's really about changing the narrative, changing the conversation to both build understanding of, how this came to be, like where were the policies informed by racism at the root, and then also talk through, what does that restitution actually look like for communities? So within the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, there's both social equity pieces of the puzzle in terms of industry participation and making sure that we're creating a framework that allows for small business participation, that centers equity and diversity. But then separate from that, not everybody wants to be a cannabis participant, right? Not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, but it might have lived in a community that was devastated by marijuana arrests. And so what does it look like to reinvest the revenue in those communities and to do things that actually build up the community, that are community led and accountable and responsive to the types of harm that was done? So what does job training look like? What does after school programs look like? What does re-entry services look like for people who were criminalized?
Right. That seems so broad because, the effects that you mentioned are so pervasive. I mean, pretty much this act, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act that your organization worked with several coalitions to create and to sponsor, it seems as if the tentacles could go very, very wide. I mean, you're saying that tax revenue from any cannabis sales should then be reinvested into these communities. Is there I've heard that there's a thought that it shouldn't be based upon, color, Latino or African American, but more so on the proportion of arrests that were in a particular area. So it could also be beneficial to communities that are, white communities or Asian communities or any communities that have seen a particular a large proportion of arrests. Is that the way that it's going to be kind of set up?
That's right. So the way it's structured in the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act is that 50% of the revenue after program costs would go to community restitution. And that would be directly responsive to the neighborhoods and to the areas that experienced criminalization, like it had that hammer of the criminal legal system just battering the entire time. And we have the arrest data to show where those are. Unfortunately, it is the case that most of those communities are Black and Latinx, but that's not to say that upstate, they didn't experience extreme harm as well. In fact, as some of the arrest numbers have been decreasing in downstate areas over the last decade or so, largely because of the work of advocates really, really pushing, we've seen that in upstate New York, like in 2017, for example, the arrest rate was actually double what it was in 1990. So we have a severe situation where there isn't the same volume necessarily just because of where populations are centered in the country. But when we look at Western New York, like the city of Buffalo, and the disparities that were there as well, it's also over 80% of the arrests consistently were Black and Latinx Buffalonians. When we look at Rochester, Syracuse, the same patterns over and over again. And then as we get to the rural areas, we see that although the volume was less, the harm was obviously there. And in many cases, took a different shape. We had people who were being held on bail by local sheriffs for 30 days, for 60 days in some cases, because of a low-level marijuana possession charge. And when we think about the disruption that causes in somebody's life, the continuing effects that has, definitely there should be opportunities for those communities to apply for restitution funds as well. But we're really clear, especially as a lot of the neighborhoods that were targets over decades and decades are now experiencing a lot of gentrification, right, that there has to be accountability within this conversation for those parameters as well, right? And so being really clear about the funds being directly responsive to the individuals and communities who experience the harm.
Right, because like you mentioned, the gentrification, I mean, Harlem, for instance, it's, we're going to put money in an area that's already bustling and booming. So we're talking about education, and not necessarily education strictly about cannabis, but education in general, because when the person's arrested, their children are not afforded as many opportunities to be educated. So it's more so general education in overall. And what about things like healthcare and things of that nature? How wide does the act go in terms of dealing with social ramifications?
Yeah, so it lays out a structure in which it can be responsive to the needs of the community, right? And so basically community entities would be able to apply for funds from the Community Grants Reinvestment Fund and say, look, this is the sort of harm that we experienced. This is what we feel would be responsive to that and how we want to go about mediating that situation. And so, when we think about community wellness and well-being and what drives health in communities, I think there's a lot of overlap and a lot of ways that communities will be able to use these funds in ways that are super responsive to what's going on. And, it might look differently from Washington Heights to, Flatbush to upstate New York. But that's no less reason why we should do it and why we should do it in a way that's really accountable to communities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because the communities themselves know what they need. So having it coming from that grassroots level makes a lot of sense. Are other cities, not across the country, not just within the state of New York, but are they looking at the act that you guys have worked on and looking to replicate that? Are we seeing the same disproportionate impact in those areas? And are people responsive to this type of conversation about social equity?
Definitely. I think it's a constantly building conversation. And so, part of what we're doing here is informed by work that was done in California, in Massachusetts, and other states that have legalized already that had social equity programs that did do community reinvestment. In Los Angeles, for example, they set aside a specific dollar amount that was intended to be restitution for communities. And we've seen the LAPD try to swoop in on those funds, like all of the ways in which exactly, we're very clear to learn from that lesson and to lockbox these funds in New York as well as we can, right? And be very intentional. In Massachusetts, they did an incredible job at building out a framework to try to have social equity applicants and business owners, and yet there's been a really low participation rate, in part because people can't access capital. They can't get financing to be in this. So what does it look like in New York for us to have an incubator program that gives 0 or low interest loans to people, has technical assistance, has all of these other things that we've seen are vital to a success for somebody being able to operate within that space as well, right? And not doing it in a sort of condescending or paternalistic way,
right?
Recognizing that people have deep amounts of expertise and knowledge, and some folks are poised to be there the second it goes legal. Other folks might need a little bit more support, and so making sure that the full spectrum of opportunities and resources are there.
Right. That's really, really exciting. And the fact that you all are looking at ensuring that these programs have, are grounded in our communities. But what about like watching it as it goes along? Because oftentimes I heard in I think it was Massachusetts, that people would apply for a grant and they would just basically be a front. They would have a person of color be a front for their organization when really it was operated by people who were not from that community. And they were able to take advantage of the system. Is there going to be monitoring of these programs throughout?
Yeah, I think there absolutely has to be, because if we're being very intentional about creating this framework, then we have to have the accountability to make sure that that's actually what's happening upon implementation. And precisely what you're saying about, we've seen the hard cases in other states of how that's being twisted or compromised, or, the shenanigans that are happening. And so we have to anticipate that behavior and both, do as much as we can on the front end to center what it means for micro businesses and co-ops and other entities like that to really be centered within this conversation, and also have the enforcement teeth and the muscle when that's not the case and when people are trying to play it different ways. We have to be very, very clear on that. But just going back to, to the national conversation, I mean, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act is something that the bill sponsors worked really closely with advocates, including DPA, the Start Smart Coalition that we're a part of, many other, immigration, housing, employment, like public defenders. You're really taking into account the whole universe of damage and harm that had been done to individuals and communities. And a lot of that actually informed the Marijuana Justice Act that's currently pending at the federal level as well. Is really built as part of that same conversation. And part of the it's a little bit harder in New York because we don't have a ballot initiative process here. That's what has been the vehicle for legalization in a lot of other states. We have to move it as a bill through the legislature, but that also gives us an opportunity because we can be more comprehensive. We can lock in more things in actual bill language through legislation like that than is possible in a ballot initiative. So that actually gives us a potential boost here in New York to set out a framework that's even more innovative, even bolder, and takes into account the lessons that we've learned elsewhere.
How close are we? I know we were going to possibly have a vote a couple of months ago or a few weeks ago, and it didn't go through. What's the next outlook?
Yeah, we absolutely have to move this legislative session in New York. So it was introduced by the governor as part of his State of the State and the budget process. That didn't happen by April 1st. And we have to hold our legislative leaders accountable for seeing this as a priority and moving it in this legislative session, which actually ends on Juneteenth. So we have a very limited amount of time to be able to move this. I would really encourage everybody who cares about this issue, both from the side of making sure that communities are no longer harmed, and also wants to see the sort of restitution and equity built into the system and the way that we responsibly regulate on the other side, to tap into the campaign, to really raise your voice right now. Tell your elected officials that this has to be a priority for them right now. You can do that by going to smart-ny.com/act. There's a lot of great tools there. There's something that allows you to call your legislature with one click and gives you a quick bullet points of what to say when you're on the phone with them. So you can be really supportive and make all the difference. Actually, we need everybody. This is not a foregone conclusion. There's a lot of great momentum. The conversation has been built in a way that is responsive to communities, but we absolutely have to get this over the finish line right now.
Yeah, what do you say to folks like older people who are concerned about the impact on children and students and teens and young people, if this goes through? I'm afraid that children are going to start using more drugs. And what are you guys doing about that at the DPA?
Yeah, I mean, this is an area of concern for us as well. And we're really looking at the fact that prohibition has not been effective at curbing youth use. It hasn't been effective at keeping young people safe, especially when we look at the arrest rates targeting people under 25 years old. So how do we have a better, more informed conversation with young people? We've seen this be really effective in terms of comprehensive sex education, in terms of other conversations around alcohol and tobacco use, where those rates have really declined among young people in the last decade. So how do we have a robust conversation with young people about cannabis? How do we address the things that are actually important for them to take into account, to delay their use, to not start using, but at the same time, have that be rooted in reality and have it be a full-fledged conversation. There are some ways in which young people self-medicate sometimes with cannabis. And so how do we bring that out of the shadows and talk through with them, what are some of the root causes driving that use? And what are some other ways that we can address that with them and actually have the resources to do that adequately as well, right? Like, what does it look to give 360-degree support to young people in a way that we can't right now under prohibition? And also looking at the experiences of other states where, in fact, youth use in Colorado and Washington has actually remained stable for most age groups and has actually dropped for 8th and 10th graders, right? Like, as young people have access to fuller and complete conversations and information, they're capable of making more informed and better decisions for themselves. And so let's do that here in New York also. And let's make sure that we're keeping kids safe from criminalization as well. So the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act very clearly makes it so that a young person will never again be saddled with a criminal record because of marijuana.
Right.
If there's an instance where they're using, where there's some problem there are channels for adequately addressing that, but it does not mean throwing the book at a young person in a way that will have lifelong implications for them.
So basically, if anyone cares about our youth, and you may have some concern about youth usage, the idea that this act can actually, provide a vehicle for our youth not to be criminalized is I think more important than, some concerns about myths and things like that. And let's give people the facts. Let's make sure they're informed. Let's make sure the youth are educated. And I know we're going to be talking with one of your colleagues about the program that the DPA has designed to educate youth about cannabis. And let's have a real conversation about where we're going with legalization in our cities, in our country.
Well, that's right. Let's broaden our toolkit from the failed policies that we have that just haven't been working. Instead of doubling down there, let's double down on what health and responsible economic justice, all of these other things actually look like. It's time to flip the playbook to a new page.
Excellent. I'm so excited. And you know what your work is so important. I'm just praying that you guys continue to have energy for the hard road ahead and that people go to the DPA, Drug Policy Alliance website, learn about who is in your specific area, that you can contact your council people, your legislators, let them know that you want decriminalization, that you don't want your children anymore to be criminalized for low-level possession, that you want education in your community, in healthcare, and you want your communities to be restored. That's what DPA is doing. So thank you for all you do. We appreciate you. And I believe you have shown us cannabis in a way we've never seen before. So let's move forward together. Thank you so much, Melissa.